Welcome to Restaurant Deal Making Exposed, the only show that equips you with everything you need to know about restaurant transactions. In this show, we tell you all about how to make the sale or purchase of your restaurant not just possible, but successful. Now here are your hosts, ex-restaurateurs and seasoned brokers, Patrick Toda and Andy Mirabel.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Restaurant Deal Making Exposed. I am Andy. I'm here with Patrick. Today, we're going to go down the top 5 buyer due diligence items, in our opinion. The due diligence process for a buyer in a restaurant or bar transaction is vital. It is during this period that a buyer can and will learn in more detail about the business they intend to buy. What they learn can alter the transaction, the terms, or their future operations of the business. The time period for due diligence is one of the most important aspects of any agreement for buying a restaurant, bar, or frankly, for any business. Asking the right questions or requesting the right items will help during the transaction and help justify or not the terms you have agreed to in purchasing this business. All right. So Patrick, it's our job to outline and guide our clients into know what to ask for and what to look for. So let's start. You start off with your big item number 1 and let's dive into this.
Yeah, I think most of the time when I'm working with a buyer, one of their biggest concerns is always the lease. And in fact, what I have found is that they often want to negotiate the lease before even going into contract, as I'm sure you've had with buyers before. Obviously, that we can't just bring anybody to the landlord and we have to be in contract, as you know. So yeah, the lease is really important. You always want to make sure that you have a signed copy of the lease. A lot of times business owners are kind of flying by the seat of their pants and they don't know where all their documents are. And sometimes I've received from the seller like an LOI of the lease or an unsigned copy because they just don't have everything all organized. So you always want to make sure that you have a signed copy of the lease. You always want to make sure that you have all of the amendments and or addendums to the lease. So you have the basic lease or the original lease plus any addendums. And so you want to make sure you have all of the documents and fully executed, obviously, so you know that you're working with the actual lease. You want to confirm the lease rates. You want to confirm what options you have. You want to confirm what the annual increases are, what the CAMs or triple nets are. These are all very, very important items.
Do you ever find errors on listings and such that this information's incorrect? I mean, this is typically why I say you really got to dive in and look at the lease in order to match it to what your client, the buyer, thinks they are getting or think the lease terms are.
Yeah, I mean, I always try to confirm what the lease terms are and make sure that I'm putting the most accurate information into my listings. I'm not going to say that there's been a couple times where I had false information that I had to go back and correct after getting a more recent copy of like an addendum, which the seller didn't provide for me at first. So you got to kind of dig a little bit, right?
I think it likewise too, we as brokers and agents, specifically us with restaurants and bars and such, we do some of our own due diligence for sellers also when it comes to lease, because before we list anything or want to move forward with a client, we need to make sure that there's not any restrictive language within the lease that would prevent them from selling or having to share their consideration, things like that. So those are also things we're looking for, right? Because you don't want those things even if we're assigning a lease to a buyer. We don't want to see those big red flag sections.
Yeah, and the most of the time a seller is going to know what they're paying in rent, obviously, because they are writing that check every month. They probably might not know what their annual increase is. You know, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. They typically have a general idea of like what their options are and when the lease is going to go up and everything. But the things that they don't usually know too much about is like the consideration clause or the recapture clause, or if they have a percentage rent. There's a lot of like other information, at least that's extremely important, especially for a buyer to know before they get involved in that particular lease, especially if it's going to be an assignment. And so I'm sure you know all about these kind of like red flag language that you find buried in a lease.
Yeah, absolutely. One other important part of the lease due diligence is oftentimes we have buyers that maybe this is their first time buying a restaurant. Maybe they're moving into a space for the first time and they have a lot of experience, but this is their first brick and mortar. Maybe they don't own a home. Maybe they don't have property or strong assets or strong financials. These are all things that we need to know about our buyer before engaging and looking at a lease, because a landlord requirements of a new tenant or an intended assignee, it's really important to that landlord to vet their financial strength, experience, and other things like liabilities and assets. So There's plenty of language that we see that doesn't allow a lease to be assigned to a tenant of lesser financial strength or lesser experiential strength than the current tenant, which at times can shoot us in the foot, because what if we're dealing with someone who's been in this 50 years, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've had a couple recent leases where it was going to be an assignment. And there was a clause in the lease that said that someone had to be at the net worth of the seller or higher. And I've had a higher net worth seller of like 5 million plus. That becomes a very challenging deal to find someone with a $5 million net worth or more. And also, if the landlord has the ability to say, okay, yes, this person has a $2 or $3 million net worth, but I'm going to do the assignment anyways. But what does that mean? That means that basically your seller is going to have to remain on the lease in second position, and basically they're not getting a full release of liability. So all these things really matter on both sides, for the buyer and the seller, and we need to know what all that looks like up front, because that really helps us when we're trying to market the business.
Yeah. At what juncture have you, or do you on a regular basis, say, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, I've reviewed this, I've highlighted the points of this lease that I find important for you to know and understand, but it's time for you to get your lawyer involved and review it?
Yeah, I tell everybody to get a lawyer involved. We look at leases from a very specific way. We look at it from a selling the business perspective. An attorney is, I think, personally worth every penny that they do, because they're going to basically all of your potential liability. You need to know that, and they need to be able to go through all that language in there that's very wordy, that they're going to see that me and you might not see, and the seller or the buyer are definitely not going to see. So I think every seller and every buyer. So if I see a lease that has like a recapture clause or any other red flags in there, I'm probably going to tell my seller, like, hey, you should talk to your attorney so that they can better understand what this language is saying, because I understand it to be this, but obviously I would check with your attorney. And before we go and try and list your business, you're going to want to know you're getting involved in.
Sure. No, I totally agree with you. There's a lot of leases that are, one, very long, very verbose. Some are patchworked together over decades. So there's a lot of different formats we see, a lot of different language we see. So getting an attorney involved to review it for your own protection as a buyer is important. There are times, though, when a lease is very straightforward. It's a nice air format lease, you know, that's plugged in a couple terms here and there. I do prep my buyer to say, hey, if you're purchasing this business and we're trying to assign this lease, and I would say this for most leases, an assignment typically means we're not changing any or some of the terms of the lease. It's transferring as is. Of course, we sometimes ask for extra time. Of course, we ask for certain concessions here and there. But for the most part, we're assigning the lease terms as is, right?
Exactly. And that's the best case scenario. Like, let's say you have a really good lease. The terms are fair to market and everything. There's a good amount of years left on it. An assignment of a lease is a far different transaction than doing a brand new lease. It's going to be less expensive for both the buyer and seller.
Correct. All right. Can we move on to number 2?
Yeah. What is number 2, Andy?
Let's talk about sales. It's a simple task to confirm sales, and especially this day, because we're dealing with mostly fully credit card business. It's not a lot of cash changing hands these days.
Yeah.
You can confirm sales in a lot of ways. You can ask for POS reports directly from their point of sale. We definitely like to review profit and loss statements. You can confirm revenue and sales by the CDTFA sales tax filings and or their business tax returns. Bank statements can also be a really good indicator, because you can see the deposits from credit cards to confirm what is coming in and when, and also the true cash flow. So anyways, that's another good tool you can use. Earnings can be found on the profit and loss statement and the tax returns. So that's another factor we have to take into account, because if the business for sale or listing is claiming a certain amount of profits, whether it's simply stated as profits, net earnings, it could be the seller discretionary earnings, it could be based on, EBITDA, whatever it may be, we need to confirm that. So how do you go about confirming these things when there are claims about profitability?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things that you said are items that I like to request, because you can kind of cross-reference everything. You can get your credit card merchant statement, make sure that matches up with your POS reports. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit of cash in there, so you have to kind of take that into consideration. But I always like looking at the bank statement, because the bank statement, you're going to see what what was the beginning balance? What was the ending balance? And if you look at that throughout obviously some months in a restaurant, you're going to have a lower ending balance than your beginning balance because of the way cash flow goes throughout you might have more payrolls in this period than in the next period or something like that, right? So you have to watch it kind of balance out. But over the course of a year, you're really going to see if this business is actually ending the month with more money than they started. And that's just a true example of a good business that you want to buy. And I think
Yeah, you can't really fudge that one.
you can't really fudge that one exactly, or unless they're putting in their own deposits to offset their losses. But you're going to be able to see that. It's kind of the one thing where you can kind of see the footprint of everything that's happening in the business. Yeah.
That makes sense. When we're looking at a profit and loss statement versus a tax return, in what scenarios do you see those not matching and how often? I see it often enough.
I do. Yeah, they're not exactly right because I think what ends up happening, and maybe this is a conversation for one of our accountants, at the end, they're probably making some last minute changes, adjustments, and all this other stuff, and depreciation and amortization. So it might not match up exactly, but you generally want it to be very close, right?
Yeah. Just like the last subject when we talked about lease, when is it time to involve the buyer's accountant or CPA? It's the same answer as before. If we're reviewing tax returns, reviewing profit and loss, financial reports, and other items, of course, we can offer our client what we see and how we interpret them, their profits and revenue and all that stuff to confirm it. But it is really good to incorporate your CPA or accountant into this process so they can put their eyes on it too.
Yeah. The other thing I want to talk about is, I don't know if this ever happens to you, but I often have buyers that want to work with the same accountant that the seller did. Do you see any kind of conflict of interest there?
If this is a going concern, they're going to carry on the same concept and everything. I don't think the accountant should be sharing records that were not previously disclosed or agreed to sharing. But yeah, there could be some sort of conflict there. What about you?
Yeah, it's just kind of weird. I mean, I would probably want my own accountant who's true to me versus like taking on the accountant that like the person I'm buying the business from. But I don't know, for whatever reason, I find that buyers often want to do that. And I don't know if there's some sort of like strategy to it. And I was just curious if you ran into that.
I think it just really goes back to the point that there's a lot of nuances to restaurants and how people do their books. So keeping something consistent or having someone who understands those books may be a benefit, but that's speculation. All right, moving on.
Item number 3, the asset list. We obviously want to know what it is we're buying. Obviously, there's tangible and intangible assets. Intangible meaning more like goodwill and stuff like that. But when buying a business, you obviously want to know what the assets are. So you want to request a full equipment list. You want to know if there's any leased equipment. You want to know if there's been any service records for the last 1 to 2 years, maintenance records.
What are the most important items that we try to have our clients vet to make sure they're well maintained?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest ones would be your hood. And I always want to know what's going on with the refrigeration, because you want to know if, your condensers are in good shape, because those are big ticket items, right? I know when I bought my business, one of the things I didn't even consider was the water heater. And I would say about 3 to 4 months into buying the business, we showed up one morning and the water heater went out on us. And it was like this 50-gallon water heater. I didn't even know where the water heater was. I didn't even consider it in the entire due diligence process. And sure enough, it was this like really big water heater. And it ended up costing a pretty penny, I remember. But it was just something like that, like an aha kind of thing. I was like, I didn't even consider it. So anyways, there's big ticket items that you really want to make sure that you look into and all that stuff.
Yeah. Another on that point, when you're looking at an equipment list and verifying stuff that is there and owned, I think you brought up the water heater, and it's a good example. A lot of health departments make you upgrade the water heater to a newer version, and you need to make sure that any water heater or equipment being used in this restaurant or bar is commercial grade. It can't be from a house. I have a client who slapped up a hood looked like from a condo in San Francisco. That was the first thing on the health department list to remove and replace.
Yeah, of course. Of course. So yeah, you want to make sure you check your condensers. Those are, and one of the telltale signs I would say is having your person come in there. They're going to be able to tell you whether there's been preventative maintenance on all that equipment. And if there has been, typically that would be less of a red flag for me. That means it's been taken care of. Hopefully in the years to come, since it's been taken care of, there's not going to be some like kaputs on you within the first year.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to make sure refrigeration is holding temperature, that gaskets are all clean and good, so they close and all that. The hoods are important because of preventative maintenance for taking out the grease and stuff, and so as to prevent a grease fire in the future if it's not been. So yeah, there's a lot of things.
When you walk into a restaurant kitchen, do you kind of get a tip off right off the bat whether or not the perception is that kitchen has been well maintained, and versus like a few things that you can probably like look at and say, oh gosh, this place is
within 10 seconds. You can see it. You can see it. I mean, if something is not clean and there is buildup in areas, whether it's grease, grime, dirt, food remnants, whatever, you know pretty immediately. Also, if buyers are buying a restaurant that's been closed, just because the refrigerators look clean and are there, they're not plugged in. If they've been off for a long time, they may not come down to temperature again. So there may be issues. So that's why we always have our buyers. This is at the end of the process, but doing a walkthrough to confirm everything is there is a must. And don't forget, if something's not listed on the equipment list, it's not part of the deal. So if this beautiful sign that says I love beer or whatever for a beer bar on the wall is not on there, and it can be unplugged and taken out the front door, it's not part of the transaction.
Absolutely. And for sellers out there, if there's a broken piece of any equipment, first of all, put it on your seller's disclosure. And secondly, don't put it on your equipment list. Otherwise, you're going to be responsible for fixing it and making sure it's in good working order. So this should be discussed up front and said, hey, this piece of equipment is not included. And so you're not responsible for fixing it before we close escrow.
True. All right. Moving on. Item 4, staff. Employees, okay? Employees are not considered property. They are not part of the transaction. But it's no mystery that we all know how vital a good existing team is to the success of a strong restaurant or bar. Sometimes the chef or other management members, like a GM, are the face of the business. These are the people and employees that help protect the consistency in food and service, smile when their regulars come in the door, and are vital for so many reasons. However, they're not part of the transaction. So a seller has to terminate them and a buyer has to rehire them. But most buyers are very motivated to keep a team in place if they're taking over an existing concept. And so that buyer wants to learn more about the team in place, their wages, their roles, where maybe they can find cuts. Maybe the buyer, owner, operator is going to offset some of these positions. So very important to know about the team and the staff. A couple ways you can do this. Request past and current payroll reporting. I did have a little side note that it may be best to have sellers omit last names and social security before sharing that information for privacy reasons and liability reasons, to be honest. So that's just a little sidebar, but it's a good habit. Just like on our tax returns from sellers, we omit personal information. We redact it before sharing it. You want to review all roles and wages that are on any payroll report that is being shared. Getting a current one, it's important. You want to watch over the course of any transaction after due diligence that there's not any increases to wages, salaries, dramatic changes to hours, things like this. This goes back to your purchase agreement where there should be no adverse changes once you're in contract to the business operations and so on. But if you have a payroll report from the first 2 weeks of May and then we're closing escrow in September, for example, and you see labor go up 20% over those 3 months, something fishy's going on. So you need to monitor that.
Yeah. I always tell my sellers that once we open escrow and the buyer has removed contingencies, from here on out, any major changes, like you're going to hire somebody, you're going to give some wage increases, you want to just disclose that to the buyer, get the buyer's buy-in to the whole thing, and just so that there's no funny surprises at the end. I actually had a situation where a seller gave all of his team a $5 an hour increase. And when I asked the seller, this really happened. And I had never understood that this could potentially be an issue. And the seller was like, well, I just wanted to make sure all the employees stayed on for the sale. So in his eyes, he was saying, I was doing it for the buyer. I was like, you can't
by giving them 20 to 40% increases. I mean, $5 an hour is a big deal in a restaurant.
Yeah. This happened literally 1 to 2 weeks before we were going to close escrow.
Oh.
And I was unsure about how we were going to resolve this, but we obviously did get through it. As you know, we always figure out some sort of way. But yeah, that was one of the more challenging situations that I've been through right before close.
Yeah, I hear that. I literally had some buyers call me, and this went through SBA financing and everything for a really successful breakfast brunch place up in Sonoma County. And after the fact, my good clients who I've done many transactions with were in there and they shook their head at me. They're like, the seller was paying people under the table. These guys don't want to stay for what they're making, and it wasn't disclosed. And sometimes there's enough to go back and go after someone, I guess, with legal recourse, but sometimes there's not. You just need to make the adjustment.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bummer though. Make sure also to review any contracts for management that may include bonus structures and things. Okay. You want to be very clear about that. All right.
Last item here. Yeah. The
big one,
the seller's disclosure. Yeah. This is a really, really important document. And I feel like for whatever reason, when I have my sellers complete it in the very beginning and when we give out our representation agreement, they don't often take it as serious as I want them to. And I'm like, no, like you need to go through this and really think about each and every question. I understand it's a little bit redundant. I understand that it's very tedious and they just want to hit no on every single one of those, responses. But you go through it and you look, it's like, do you have gift cards? Yeah. Okay. Well, let's disclose that. I don't care if the balance is $100 or $50,000, but we got to put that on there, right?
How do we handle gift cards, by the way? I think that's sometimes a little bit of a surprise to folks.
Yeah. I just had a deal recently, which had the business was selling their gift cards at Costco and they had like a huge number, like $60,000. And so I was like, oh gosh, this is going to be a deal killer. But again, we sorted it out. And typically what I tell both sides is that it's going to be a percentage of the total balance. And the reason why we do a percentage of the total balance is because for two reasons. First of all, in order to service that balance, you're talking about the cost of goods. And typically cost of goods is roughly 30%, give or take. So it's going to cost us, the buyer, roughly 30%. I mean, I guess you could say labor as well, but typically the food part of that is about 30%. Secondly, as the balance gets older, there's less and less chance that it's going to be cashed in. What I always tell everybody is, and this is another great due diligence request, is find out the aging report. Find out where all those balances are from for the last however many years. So you can see how much of it is 5 years or older, or how much is like current, like in the last 1 or 2 years, because that all really matters on figuring out what percentage you're going to provide for the seller to provide to the buyer. Yeah.
Yeah. Typically I've thrown out numbers like 50 cents on the dollar up to 85 cents on the dollar. And a lot of the mom and pop locations that we sell and so on that are more one unit and paper gift certificates, things like that, not Costco, because those are selling and probably coming in at a higher rate. But a lot of the mom and pop ones have gift cards that are so old, they're never going to see them again. So yeah, cool. Yeah, that's an important one.
Yeah. So there's all kinds of things. You want to list any broken equipment. You want to list anything that you know that could potentially affect the business, positive and negative. It doesn't have to always be negative. You want to put any leased equipment on there. You want to put all your licenses, whatever licenses you hold for that business. And that could be different for each and every one. There's all kinds of information in there. And I tell sellers, you want to be as thorough as possible. Do you have any EIDL loans that you want to list? Yes, it's a personal guarantee and it's going to follow you, but that also is on the business as well. And you need to list that, because if it comes up later that you owe a bunch of sales tax or you have a SBA loan and you didn't disclose it, it could affect you. The buyer
could derail the deal. It could also make the deal a negative escrow. There's a lot of repercussions.
Yeah. And then basically the seller's going to have to, if the buyer wants to cancel escrow after they've removed contingencies, they would technically have a leg to stand on because you didn't disclose this really impertinent information.
Yeah, agreed. Just a sidebar on the EIDL loan. This came from the pandemic for the disaster relief. And I'm still on roughly 50% of my deals. They're still involved at some level. So it's 2025 and they're still there and they have a big impact because those loans are collateralized by the assets of the business. Yeah, great. So, we talked about leased equipment. You talked about broken equipment. If a piece of equipment is listed and it's just, there's a disclosure about its condition, repair, or needed repair or whatnot, technically you would hope that the seller would not have to credit some credit out of pocket for that. But if it's not disclosed, you're absolutely going to have to do something about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that document is extremely important. I think sellers should take it as such. Yeah.
Totally. All right. Let me do a little recap here. We got our top 5 buyer due diligence items. Definitely dive into that lease. A hefty review of the lease with your broker and hopefully your attorney is important. 2, dive into the financials, sales reports, P&Ls, sales tax filings, bank statements, tax returns, and such. That's how you're going to prove the past performance and profitability of the restaurant that you are buying. 3, your FF&E, your equipment list. It's a vital part of the transaction. Those are the tangible assets you're buying. 4, staff. Although they're not part of the transaction, they're vital to the operations of the business. So it's important to know who has what role, what they're paid, and so on. And then lastly, sellers' disclosures. Disclosures for buyer and sellers, but especially sellers, are vital. They're important pieces of information. And there's going to be a lot of different categories that are covered in disclosures that will help a buyer know what is going on behind the scenes or if there's anything that they should be worried about. Does that sound about right for the top 5 due diligence items for buyers, Patrick?
You nailed it. I think those are all really, really good start to getting through your transaction in the due diligence period.
Thank you. And we nailed it. Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that. All right. Here, bonus question. Here we go. Patrick, you just got back from Spain. I'm utterly jealous and I want to put you on the spot somehow. Can you share your most memorable dining experience while you were in Spain with us?
My most memorable dining experience in Spain. Wow. Well, let's see here. I don't know that there's just one experience. I think the overall experience of dining in Spain was very memorable. Just the culture around eating there. And first of all, you can't go out before 8:00 to eat dinner. Everything starts at 8:00. That's like the 5 p.m. period basically
that
here.
Would be
That's
hard for me. That would be hard.
No.
I go to sleep pretty early on the weekdays.
I thought that was going to be hard for me too, but somehow the whole day just kind of shifted. And I was waking up later and I was going to sleep later. You go out, the whole tapas culture where you order a drink and you get a free tapa. I don't know how they do it, how the economics work, but you can literally drink your way to a bunch of food and not have to pay for it, right? It's just a different program of eating. You're constantly ordering all these small plates. Nothing is really ever in an entree portion type situation. I was kind of happy to come home and get a entree dinner and just kind of get just very focused into that. But over there, it's just you're ordering a bunch of different things and the table's just filled with a bunch of little Mazda-sized platters. So
nice. I'm jealous. It's on my list. I can't wait to go. I'm glad you had a really good time. That sounded amazing.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. I think we are good to go. Please listen to our upcoming episodes. We'll have some exciting new guests on and we look forward to next time.
I'll see you guys later. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to worry about missing an episode, you can follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you found today's episode interesting or useful, please share it with someone you think would benefit and consider leaving a rating and review.
Reviews help restaurant owners or buyers just like you discover this podcast and benefit from the important topics covered in the episodes. Your opinion matters to us as a listener, so feel free to leave topic suggestions and feedback for us, as we will use these to tailor the episodes to you and help you get the most out of listening.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of Restaurant Deal Making Exposed. If you're considering selling your business and would like a free consultation, reach out to Patrick and Andy at therestaurantsalesbroker.com or visit www.therestaurantsalesbroker.com to learn more.